Exposing the Expositions, Chapter 6, narrated by author Howdy McCoskey. The next and final fair to talk about is the 1915 Panama Exposition in San Francisco. It was the last of the great fairs and becomes the marker, with World War I, for what came historically before and after. Prior to the First World War, the fairs had an industrial theme based around Greco-Roman buildings. After the war came a more modern-style exposition building and a focus on science and carnival-type fun. San Francisco. The name to the state of California was given to it when the Spanish owners believed, or may have correctly understood, that California was an island. As such, the area was named after the mythological island in the famous novel Las Sergas de Esplandian by García Rodríguez de Montalvo. In his book, an island east of Asia was inhabited only by black Amazon-type women. In the 1960s, this area became the state of beach California girls culture. The queen of these women was called Khalifa, who is linked to a fortune of gold. California has since become known as the Golden State. So is this from the gold rush of 1849, or was there something about gold in California that was known long before that? Cities of the lost gold west of the Mississippi were folklore of the American East Coast. They may not have been simple legends, but based on actual truth. Something seems truly linked with the mythological 1400s novel and the land that became known as the American state of California. Perhaps it was not a mythical novel, but pointing to something much more real. The Spanish are claimed to have ventured to the area of San Francisco in 1769. Soldiers and a small group of settlers arrived in 1776, a coincidental date as it is also the start of the U.S. Revolution and the signing of the Declaration of Independence. For some reason, it seems that the date 1776 wants to be stamped in the head of every student of history and the start of anything in the United States. A fort, Presidio, and a mission, Dolores, were built. The new Spanish settlement was given the name Yerba Buena, supposedly meaning good herbs, reminding me of Chicago supposedly being named for onions. It became a trading center for visiting ships. Mexico gained its independence from Spain in the 1820s and took over California. In 1835, Englishman William Richardson built a house in Yerba Buena and set up a street plan for the new city. Of course, in the standard historical narrative, not one Spaniard or Mexican had ever thought of setting up a future street city plan. It took a great heroic English person to show up and suddenly do so. The Hudson's Bay Company opened a trading post in 1841, and the Wikipedia article claims, quote, "A large building on the water's edge was purchased." What large building? We have drawings of what the city was supposed to look like in 1848, such as above. Where is the large building that can be purchased in 1841? The trading post lasted a year and then was closed, and the Hudson Bay Company returned to Vancouver. So what happened to the large building? The next claim is important. Quote, "The settlement was arranged in the Spanish style around a plaza that remains as the present-day Portsmouth Square." End quote. Again, when you look at the drawing of San Francisco in 1848 above, where is the supposed plaza? We'll come back to that question shortly. 1846 becomes an interesting year for San Francisco. It has a population of 800, a fort, a mission, and an unseen plaza. Early in that year, North California was claimed by the U.S. from Mexico in the Mexican-American War on July 7, supposedly without firing a shot. Sailors from the ship Portsmouth went into Yerba Buena and raised the American flag over the town plaza when the town offered no resistance. The name of the area was changed to that of a ship, becoming Portsmouth Square. Just 3 weeks later, July 31, 1846, 240 Mormon migrants led by Sam Brannan arrive on the ship Brooklyn. It seems very coincidental to have them show up less than 3 weeks after one U.S. Navy ship captured the city. Why would they be coming to a Mexican city? Because they could have not got everything together in less than 3 weeks. They had to have been coming before the city was taken over. By January 30, 1847, Yerba Buena had changed its name to San Francisco. This, of course, is odd because the new U.S. settlers chose a Spanish name, St. Francis, for a small town that they had just captured. It makes no sense at all. English people like to name cities New York and New London and New Hampshire. so the Spanish name must have been part of the city long before it became American. In 1848, James Marshall is supposed to have found gold, again which is announced in Portsmouth Square, but took another year before the gold rush of 1849 began. In 1 year, the population of the city was to rise from 1,000 to 25,000. The gold rush and Mormon arrival of 1846 do not seem on the surface to be linked, but they may be. We Warrior website had found that Joseph Smith, the organizer of the Mormon Church, came from, quote, a family of money diggers who claimed they could locate treasure by looking at a stone and a hat. The Mormons also settled in Salt Lake City in the 1850s, and then all of a sudden spectacular architecture springs up overnight. So We Warrior speculates that Smith may have had some sort of knowledge or ancient map as to where the old cities were, and not using hats and stones, cities that included great treasures. The man credited with the California gold discovery, James Marshall, was working for the leader of the Mormon settlers, Samuel Brannan, the one who arrived suddenly in 1846. In fact, it was Brannan on May 12, 1848, who was the one who made headlines by running through the streets of San Francisco with a bottle full of gold, starting the actual gold rush. Brannan owned the store where all the mining supplies were purchased and made a killing in the selling of the supplies to the original gold diggers and became the first millionaire in the state. The point, of course, was to give a reason to shift large numbers of population westward to work in the gold and mercury mines and other endeavors. By 1870, the city had a population of 150,000. Okay, that's quite a story. How true is it, though, to go from 800 people to 150,000 in 30 years? Let us look at a few things much closer, and this Portsmouth Square is going to be a central part of this investigation. In the above photo is what they want you to think San Francisco looked like in 1851, and the very spot where the flag was supposed to be raised in 1847, and would make sense given the standard history presented. But below this is another photo from 1851, this of the harbor. In this photo, or in this image, where did all the buildings come from in just 4 years? Because according to a very detailed article in sfmuseum.org, this Plymouth Square was bustling long before 1850. First, the article claims there was a giant customs house, but more importantly, there were a series of great hotels, a line of palaces, the magnificence of which the interior even more than corresponds to the promises of their outward show. They were devoted to the fickle goddess Fortune, but they were good lounges, for one could withstand temptation. End quote. One was the Parker House, first built in the spring of 1849. It was 65 feet long along the square and 145 feet in depth with 2 stories high. But where is this structure in the square 2 images above? What is the history of these hotels? Oh yes, like all cities, everything important gets burned in a fire and has to be rebuilt. This hotel was rebuilt 4 times. Why? Because history claims that early San Francisco went through 5 massive city fires. January 4, 1849, December 24, 1849, May 4, 1850, June 14, 1850, September 17, 1850. Each time the hotels and all the buildings are rebuilt, only to have it all burned down again. At least that's the story. But then we have the painting, or really a lithograph, below of the square from 1850, and it's very damning to the actual historical story. Take a close look at this drawing. It is a drawing by John Pendergast, 1850, claimed to be the statehood celebration in Plymouth Square. That should be Portsmouth Square. That above is the same Portsmouth Square in the photograph in 1851. Notice anything odd? How about the Parthenon-looking building to the left? Or the giant column structure further beyond? Who was building this in 1849, when standard history claims shacks and 1,000 people? Why are none of these buildings appearing in the 1851 Portsmouth Square image? If everything was getting destroyed in fires, how could any of the buildings from the lithograph burn down, because quite clearly they're made of brick and stone and not wood? What is the real story of Portsmouth Square? Where the city was captured in war, gold was announced, statehood celebrated, and where these great hotels stood. But then we are given the cowboy-looking 1851 photograph. Yet this photograph above looks like downtown Athens. Again, lithograph. So which is true? Was this the real story of the growth of San Francisco? I must stop the flow of the book to present 7 images. The complete photographs give a complete panoramic view, that of the city photographed in 1878. Let's just look at 2 of them for this part of San Francisco. This might be the most shocking piece of photographic evidence out there. What you are looking at is a panorama of San Francisco, claimed to have been taken in 1878. It was taken by Edward Muybridge, the same man who later gave a moving picture display in the 1893 Chicago Exposition. Look at the size of the city. There might be 500,000 people there. Look at the buildings. Huge towers, domes, facades, beautiful architecture, a cathedral that would fit right in central Moscow. Can that really be built in less than 30 years? With all the ornate finish on the roofs and the columns and mansions, after having started with a city of just miners and cowboys? I don't think so. And neither does my building contractor friend. The amount of manpower and machine power that would be needed were enormous unless A, they had a technology they were not supposed to have, or B, much of the city was built and was there from long ago. There's no other answer. The gold rush may have been a fabricated story to get people to move from the east to the west and start filling up these mostly empty cities that had just been found in California. All the new arrivals would be told it was just built. This panorama is actually very destructive to the standard historical narrative. But there's much strangeness in the panorama. No construction work of any kind is going on. Everything everywhere is finished. No one even has a scaffold out doing finishing up painting. This is supposed to be a booming city, with thousands moving there every day. Wouldn't there be a need to be building something somewhere? Even more spooky is that there are no people, no horses, no nothing. Okay, maybe 50 horses and carts and 100 people, and the clock tower shows 12:30, so it's midday, but where are all the people? The standard explanation is that early cameras had to take 10-minute exposures, so the photographer kept people out of the photos. Really? They could keep 200,000 people and 50,000 horses out of a photo for 10 minutes? There would be a ton of blurring in these photos and people and horses moving around, but there's no blurring. Let's be clear. There are almost no people in this city when this panorama was taken. And we see similar city photos all over the world during this time period, 1860 to 1880, a complete city with no work being done and no people to be found anywhere. I think we're looking at the city at the edge of being taken over, found dead, discovered. This might be a photo the day the resettlement began, not some 20 years after being founded with log cabins by some cowboys and miners. The drawing we have in Portsmouth Square indicates that San Francisco is not what was normally presented in this period. What were historians doing during this time frame? If this were all true, why was no one reporting it? 1894 Fair. Well, the San Francisco Fair of 1915 will be our focus. Few people know that there was actually an earlier major fair in that city in 1894 on the heels of the ending of the one in Chicago. The 1894 fair opened on January 27 and took place in Golden Gate Park and ended on July 4. The idea came from Chicago Exposition Commissioner Michael H. DeYoung, who thought, as the country was going through a giant recession, that a fair in California would help to stimulate the economy. Now, of course, to me, this seems more like a money grab for him than anything else. Here he was in charge of the Chicago Expo. He had all of these people from all over the world setting up at the Midway exhibits, and I think the idea was convince some of them to stay and ship the show in a smaller version to San Francisco. Of course, why specifically San Francisco and not Los Angeles is a question. But there were issues. Golden Gate Park Superintendent John McLaren had no interest in a fair in his park, stating the damage to the natural setting would take decades to reverse. But even over McLaren's great objections, the fair was built. It seems that a new construction record was reached. Bancroft's Fair book added a chapter on the 1894 fair and wrote, quote, "Not least among the wonders of the 1894 exposition was the speed with which the structures were erected. It might be said that, like the city which contains them, they sprang up almost in a night." It was not until late in September that the contracts for the first buildings were awarded, and yet at the formal opening on 27 of January, a space of about 4 months, all the principal and most of the minor pavilions were practically completed. While none of them rivaled the magnificent proportions of the Columbian temples, there are many whose skillful composition and beauty of design leave nothing to be desired. The fair encompassed 200 acres, 120 structures were built, and more than 2 million people visited. Like all the other fairs, most of the buildings were torn down after the event, so all that was done in 4 months' time was almost overnight." End quote. 200 acres and 120 giant buildings in 4 months. Reminded many times in the passage that they sprung up almost in a night, like the city which contains them. This metaphorical presentation of the fairs going up as if magical power was used is used again and again in the books of the period. The administration building featured a 135-foot tall dome with figures in relief. The agriculture building featured 3 domes to let in the light for the plants. The 266-foot-high Bonnet Tower was a large steel tower set in the center of the Grand Court of Honor that used electrical lighting. It was approximately a third the size of the Eiffel Tower after which it was modeled. The tower was adorned with 3,200 multicolor lights, and the upper level of the tower had a spotlight. Bancroft wrote, "In the illumination of the fair, the electric tower is the principal feature, for here is one of the most powerful searchlights in the world, its comet-like rays distinctly visible for more than 50 miles at sea." End quote. This may mean what it seems it does, or it could be a reference to the tower that in fact was the principal feature in making electricity, not in presenting it. The tower stayed for 2 years after the fair until McLaren had it destroyed with high-powered explosives. Yes, explosives. The Fine Arts Building was an Egyptian revival structure surmounted with a likeness of Hathor. The building itself was a brick structure 50 feet high with a small pyramid on top. After the Midwinter Exposition ended, it remained, as it was intended to be a permanent structure, and became the Fine Arts Museum. The 1906 earthquake apparently ruined the integrity of the building, which led to closure for repairs. It was not destroyed or vaporized like the rest of the city, just suffered some structural damage. In 1929, the building was finally torn down. The Manufacture and Liberal Arts Building, 170,000 square feet, featured many displays from the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which again tends to me believe that this was just a do-it-again quick kind of venture. Like Chicago, there was an ethnic village, an Eskimo, African, and popular Cairo street. The Santa Barbara Amphibia was an exhibit that held many species of marine life that made the Santa Barbara Channel their home, basically a giant aquarium. It was faced with the giant pyramid there. After the fair, McLaren made sure to have all the fair destroyed from his park, but why he kept the Fine Arts Building with its Egyptian look and the Japanese village, along with multiple statues, is not adequately explained. Earthquake, 1906. We have seen that, like Chicago and St. Louis, San Francisco had its share of city-destroying fires in the 1800s. But this city goes one better on the destruction scale. The earthquake of 1906. I mean, we have lots of photographs and had witnesses about this disaster. Surely that must be as history states. Well, the earthquake story is quite strange once it gets examined. The first oddity is that there's a video of it. Well, sort of. The first video is a trip down the main street from a cable car, taken just 4 days before the quake. How lucky. The entire video seems staged based on what the cars, wagons, and people in front are doing. Basically, it's a Hollywood film of a streetcar ride in San Francisco. Okay. But then the 7.9 quake comes on April 18 that leads to a series of firestorms being created, as happened in Chicago and other destroyed cities of the period, that lasted at least 2 days. 4 days after the quake, another video was taken, on seemingly the same cable car going down the same street. How convenient. What is odd when watching the second video, and you can see both on YouTube, is how calm the people are that are walking around. Basically, the entire city's been destroyed, loved ones and animals killed, badly injured, yet everyone is walking around like they're headed to watch a football game. It makes it all more odd. When you look at photos taken during the fire, and there are lots of them such as the one above, the people also seem odd. Here there are hundreds of people on the streets, all watching the event, and they are dressed in their best clothes as if they're on their way to church and just stopped to enjoy a view of the fire before heading off to get their hair cut. They're not at all behaving like a city in the midst of an earthquake causing the city to be burning all around them. There's even a group of guys on the right side just sitting on chairs casually watching the city burn. Huh? Move out some belongings, help an old person or some children get to safety. No, here they just sit and watch the city burn down while they eat lunch. And it's not the only photo of its kind. There's another odd photo. It is a group of women high on a hill getting their selfie taken with a burning city in the background. Why would they be so happy and joyous? That makes no sense. Are they time travelers? Some group involved in creating the disaster? Sick psychopaths? Or something else going on here? It almost feels like to me that the people in these photos are just like the people in the video from the streetcar. Actors, movie extras. For actors do this on movie sets. Take picture with the stars or the set they're working on. I see them as people paid to be there and make it look like something is happening. But what is happening? Was there really an earthquake? How about the photos of the destruction itself? Go look for yourself on the internet. The city is basically crushed, yet again the utility poles are all standing fine. What exactly does that kind of damage? Direct bombardment from a battleship? Bombs from a B-29 bomber? Interestingly, the Roman pillars and giant domes seem to make it through, but the next photo is very problematic. This one is supposed to be taken over a month after the earthquake in May 1906. Another image shows cleaner streets even cleaner streets just 2 weeks after. First of all, look at the damage. It appears as though 90% of this part of the city is wiped out. Again, this looks like the site of a World War II bombing raid. Yes, earthquakes can be devastating. We've all seen them on newscasts in our lifetime. But I don't think I've ever seen images of basically an entire city looking like it had been nuked. Second, and more odd, where's all the rubble from the collapsed structures? You cannot clean up the remains of 10,000 destroyed buildings in a few weeks. It took years to clean up the collapse of the World Trade Center in New York City, and that is with the best modern equipment. Horse crews could not clean up an entire city after an earthquake this fast. This city looks vaporized, and I don't think a giant fire alone can do that. What is more odd is how most of the wooden utility poles, electricity or wireless internet or whatever they are, seem to make it through the fire just fine. So what happened? When did it happen? It is also claimed that San Francisco could burn so fast, like all the other fire cities, was because all of the buildings were made of wood. Yet look close at that 1878 panorama photos again. There are a few wood buildings in there, but like Chicago, most are brick and stone. Something is just not right with these city-to-city destruction stories. Can we get some other clues about this? In the photo above, it's a picture of a statue damaged in the earthquake. What are the odds that the statue could crash through the stone street like that? This is very clearly a staged photo, but why? What is the message? The statue is of Louis Agassiz, who was the key professor of biology and geology at Harvard University from just after his arrival in the U.S. in 1847 until his death in 1873. He was also the founder of the Museum of Comparative Zoology and was one of the first scientists to claim that there had been an ice age on Earth. He was most famous for being a staunch resistor to the theories of Darwin's evolution. It was why he lost his credibility with the scientific community just before his death. Science buried him and his ideas, just like the way the statue is depicted above. A key in the complete photo is that the word zoology above the door is clearly centered in the shot. Symbolically, it's saying that Agassiz had been burying his head in the sand, as anyone else who was not believing in Darwin or who happened to be holding to religious ideas about this reality. So why do this after a city being destroyed by an earthquake? Would not everyone have much more to do with basic survival than how to dig out a street to make a symbolic photo? Again, it's hard to know just what was going on in April 1906. A researcher from the site stolenhistory.org located a series of documents from 1906 that can be seen on the sfmuseum.net website. Without going into all the details here, the basic overview is that a series of Army Corps engineers were using dynamite on buildings just after the earthquake. It describes the days of April 18 and 19 when buildings were blown up far enough ahead of the fire to avoid feeding the fire with flying embers and to effectively stop the fire for lack of fuel by cutting a broad open belt ahead of it. So this is claiming that the buildings were being blown up on purpose to stop the fire from, destroying the buildings. That sounds odd. He then provides the name of all the brave men involved in the operation and that they should be given special commendation by the military for their service on those days. Is this true? Or simply just a very nice explanation to explain the ruins of buildings that could not be explained by simple fire alone? Or were buildings dynamited without there having been a city fire? A second letter found at the SF Museum site was sent from Benj.L. Wheeler of the University of California to President Taft on July 24, 1906, discussing a different letter sent by the U of C professor H. Morse Stevens, asking to see the complete report by General Greeley. Wheeler's letter states, quote, "Dear Secretary Taft, the enclosed letter implies a request which I deem reasonable and worthy. Professor Stevens is a first-rate historical scholar and withal a man of rare tact and good judgment. He is making up the story of the disaster and its relief as a sample of the proper type of historical investigation. You can trust absolutely to his discretion and wisdom. Faithfully yours." End quote. What exactly is this letter? Suggesting regarding Stevens making up the story of the disaster. Does that mean he's working on documenting the moment-by-moment details for posterity? Or is he in charge of making it up, as in fabricating a false story? It is speculation based on the wording of the document, but I thought I needed to add it to this explanation. Next comes another odd photograph. Well, it may not seem odd on first glance, just a picture of San Francisco after having rebuilt the city. What is odd is the time frame of this photo, 1909, and in fact some similar photos can be found dated to 1908. You've seen the earthquake disaster photos where basically nothing is left. How can in 2 years a complete build of all the brick and stone buildings we see in this 1909 photograph happen? It's just not possible. Could anyone believe that San Francisco had been totally rebuilt in 2 years? Or was the city in 1908 fine and had been fine all along? Basically, it was not fully built in 2 years and then photographed with zero construction happening in the photographs. So this either means one of two things. If A, there was a disaster in San Francisco, it must have been a long time prior, at least 100 years, and was photographed at the time, meaning photography was much older than claimed, and then the city was fully built over a course of about 100 years. Hence, the 1878 panorama from earlier could be a genuine image, but after really 100 years of building after a much older earthquake. If this is true, then the earthquake of 1906 was some sort of forged event, using the photos of the original long ago disaster. Or another choice, B, there was no disaster at any time to San Francisco, and in 1906 perhaps a small part of the city was purposely destroyed, say with dynamite. That area was photographed from several angles to suggest that the city was like the entire area. It then becomes easy to rebuild 10 or 20 blocks of a city in 2 years or so because the rest of the city is fine. With either scenario, because of the belief of a destroyed city in an earthquake, there will be no question that as to the age of the buildings. Well, they all have to be after 1906 because everything before that had been destroyed. I'm actually leaning to a combination of A and B here, that something happened in San Francisco a long time in the past, and it was just pasted over to pretend to have happened in 1906. Another oddity is a 1908 photo of an Elks Club meeting in San Francisco. The elites are gathering, and obviously happily living it up and partying. This while much of the city is supposed to be still living in refugee camps and barely functioning slums, which of course we don't see in the main photos, we see fully functioning cities. These people in the Elks Club photo don't have a care in the world. This very image reminds me of the closing shot of Kubrick's masterpiece, The Shining, a movie that links later with Eyes Wide Shut, to present the control of the masses and who it is that's doing the controlling. Kubrick's party and this Elks party seems to be the same. San Francisco holds a medium-sized fair in 1909, the Portola Festival. While there are not many photos of this fair, mainly just the starting parade, there are a lot of posters from it, and they are very odd. A Spanish-looking woman cuddling a bear overlooking the city, or a Spanish-looking woman walking down some Greek steps surrounded by roses. No matter, the presentation being made after 1906 is that San Francisco, just like Chicago was, is a phoenix rising out of the ashes to bring a beautiful new world to everyone's day-to-day lives. Of course, again, all the main buildings need to emulate ancient Rome or ancient Athens. The 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. That brings us to the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition of San Francisco, which was to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal. It began on February 20, but the exposition had much to show off of the city's amazing recovery from the earthquake. Quote, When the exposition opened in 1915, San Francisco looked fabulous. Bedecked with ornate, European-inspired architecture and an array of technological wizardry, the city resumed its role as a West Coast powerhouse less than a decade after near-total destruction. Block after block of property was flattened by the 1906 earthquake, and ensuing fires had been transformed to make way for glitzy new hotels, sturdy apartment buildings, landscape parks and courtyards, office theaters, and sparkling gold-topped City Hall. New streetcar lines were built to carry visitors and locals to the fair, much of which rose on previously uninhabitable lots along the city's northern waterfront. The Panama Pacific International Exposition showed the world that the city had reached new heights of grandeur, launching the modern incarnation of San Francisco like a phoenix from the ashes." End quote. Like Chicago, they also chose a swamp area, today known as the Marina District. The fair was constructed on a 636-acre site between the Presidio and Fort Mason. Before the fair, it was supposed to be a small 400-property neighborhood known as Harbor View. The buildings were all claimed to have been demolished to make way for the fairgrounds. But as Laura Ackerley wrote in her 2015 book, there was collusion about it. Though nearly 100 earthquake refugee shacks had been located in Harbor View, their owners were evicted after the homes were condemned by the Department of Health. But of course, they only condemned the shacks in the Harbor View area, nowhere else in the city. Wikipedia claimed, quote, 76 city blocks had been cleared or filled to set the stage for the exposition, end quote. So why would the area need to be cleared if an earthquake and fire had basically destroyed the city? And if they did spend a great amount of time and energy to build things on these sites after an earthquake, why would you then tear them all down? Why would you build temporary structures and not something else more sturdy? Let us take a look at the building of this fair, as this is the one that has the most photographs to date after St. Louis. Many of the photos are of temporary wood buildings. Now, of course, that does not mean that there were not also permanent buildings, just that some wood construction, which might have been the only construction, is what appears to be in the photographs. Fine, you say again. They wanted stage photos with just a few men to show off the buildings. But with a workforce of 20,000, there would be signs of them around. A cup left on the ground somewhere, a half of a sandwich, some nails, a hammer sitting along something. However, once again, the ground is barren of any semblance of work in any of the photos. The 5-volume book Story of the Exposition by Frank Morton Todd, put out in 1921 by Putnam & Sons, has many construction photos in its second volume. And it is quite clear that certainly many of the buildings are just what they say, wood structures including iron and steel truss roofs. In fact, there is more steel going into these buildings than I've seen at any fair prior to this one, save Chicago. But this fair also produces another problem when looking carefully at many of the buildings. They show signs of weathering, long-term weathering. So how are buildings supposed to show 50 or 100 years of weathering if they've just been put up the year previously? That there was even a fair in 1915 should be questioned by people. Over 30 countries sent exhibits to San Francisco while World War I was going on. Granted, Britain and Germany withdrew and sent no exhibits, however, France still did. No one seemed too concerned about shipping expensive exhibits and priceless art across the Atlantic in the middle of the biggest war the world had ever known, a war that included German submarine attacks in open water. Oh, and there wasn't just a World Fair in San Francisco. No, there was a similar one going on just south in San Diego at the same time. And San Diego seems not to have torn down many of their buildings, but kept many, such as the California Building with its dome, California Tower, and the current Museum of Art with its statue-lined front facade. Why was San Diego so special to be the only exposition city of 30 years to build several permanent buildings? Let us now look at the finished product in San Francisco. Looking at these structures, hundreds of buildings, domes, columns, statues, lagoons. The exposition was sometimes referred to as the Dome City because of the many buildings with dome tops, including the Palace of Fine Arts, Festival Hall, the Manufacturers Palace, the Liberal Arts Palace, the Palace of Horticulture, and the Palace of Varied Industries. The buildings had a very strict 8-color pastel theme that they had to be adhered to, so that the overall effect was one of complete unity between the buildings. The Tower of Jewels was 435 feet tall centerpiece of the exposition. Emily Post described the building as a diamond and turquoise wedding cake. It was taller than the other fair buildings by a couple of 100 feet and was positioned at the main Scott Street entrance to the fair. It was covered with over 100,000 cut glass nova gems, which sparkled in sunlight throughout the day and were illuminated by over 50 powerful electrical searchlights at night. Quote, "Made in Bohemia, the nova gems came in several colors of glass and were mounted on brass hangers with a small mirror behind them to further increase their reflection. As these jewels freely hung from the sides of the building, the breezes would make them independently sway, causing the building to shimmer in a way that people say was impossible to describe unless one saw it in person." End quote. Inside were a variety of large printed murals depicting allegorical scenes of such things as Balboa discovering the Pacific Ocean and the progress of the Panama Canal. On a few special occasions, they put on an event known as the Burning of the Tower, where, according to Todd's story of the exposition, quote, "Concealed ruby lights and pans of red fire behind the colonnades on the different galleries seemed to turn the whole gigantic structure into a pyramid of incandescent metal glowing toward white heat and as if it was about to melt. From the great vaulted base to the top of the sphere, it had the unstable effulgence of a charge in a furnace, and yet it did not melt, however much you expected it to, but stood and burned like some sentient thing doomed to an eternal torment." End quote. The lighting director for the fair was Walter Darcy Ryan, who had worked for General Electric. Ryan used new techniques to light up all the buildings. In the Court of the Universe, Ryan concealed 1,500-watt lamps inside the decorative glass columns rising from the two center fountains. By day, they appeared to be sculpted from marble, but at night they transformed into bright beams of light. In the Court of Abundance, real flames burned in the mouths of sculpted snakes, where an 18-foot glass sphere in the Fountain of Earth utilized carefully placed interior lighting to imitate the effects of a massive rotating globe. Throughout the grounds, the evening ambiance was manipulated with carefully placed spotlights, softly glowing flames held aloft by statues, and bulbs concealed behind banners and other architectural details. The Palace of Machinery was the largest building on the grounds and had all sorts of exhibits showing modern America's heavy machinery, machine tools, steam, gas and oil engines, passenger elevators, and hoisting apparatuses, as well as electrical exhibits by Westinghouse and Edison. Inside the Palace of Horticulture's glass dome, the so-called electric kaleidoscope projected images of comets, sunsets, and fluttering spots resembling butterflies, waving ribbons, and other shapes. Every state in the Union had a building representing them at the exposition. Some states designed traditional conservative buildings, while some tried to use more of the fare of the original by designing buildings that conveyed a sense of what their state represented. For example, Oregon State Building was a replica of the Parthenon, but instead of Greek marble pillars, they substituted 48 huge redwood trunks, one representing each state in the Union. Virginia's building was a reproduction of George Washington's home at Mount Vernon, and included many pieces of furniture used by Washington. There were 30,000 imported plants, trees, bushes, and flowers, including 70,000 rhododendrons. The landscape architect for this fair was none other than John McLaren. Yes, the John McLaren who so hated the 1894 fair that he had the tower dynamited when he was over. But now, all of a sudden, he is Mr. Fair. He needs to be more closely looked at as well. A telephone line was established in New York City so people across the continent could hear the Pacific Ocean. The Liberty Bell traveled by train on a nationwide tour from Philadelphia to attend the exposition. A 5-acre scale model of the Panama Canal was built, and the way it was painted gave the impression as if seeing the entire 1,000-mile real canal. Another exhibit was a simulated ride over Arizona's Grand Canyon. Manufacturing was a key for this fair. The automobile was center, and Henry Ford had an assembly line set up that produced 18 new cars every day of the fair, each ending by being driven off the line. But there was more. All sorts of the new assembly line items were down making products before people's eyes, such as fire hoses and blue jeans. New airplanes were taking passengers for tours for the very high cost of a $10 fee. Quote, "The concession was run by two brothers whose last name was spelled Lougheed. Although they had already gone broke at least once, they refounded the Lougheed Aircraft Company using their profits from the fair." End quote. What author Ackley also makes clear in her book is that even though this was the new era of the car, and the car was being showcased, she quoted, "You had this modern fair, but horses and mules were critical to building it." End quote. So again, she and other historians are following the basic premise that even though machines were available, they still had all the lumber and stone dragged by horses. Visiting the fair was an expensive ticket. Granted, the admission was only 50 cents. The problem was that to do anything cost money. Take a ride on the Midway? Money. Buy food? Money. Take a train ride? Money. Though many still try to portray that the average person could attend due to the fair entrance only costing 50 cents, that meant the poor could go, but they couldn't do or eat anything. As soon as this fair came to a close, the demolition began. It took far less time to tear this down than Chicago or St. Louis or the others. A campaign started to save the Palace of Fine Arts, which kept it from being added to the immediate demolition. The building survived well into the 1960s until it went through a complete reconstruction. Now again, why did they choose just to save one building, and just how temporary was the structure if it made it fine into the 1960s? Again, San Francisco had no problem keeping its fair buildings, the only fair city since 1851 to have done so. I would love to have had a very close inspection of the buildings on site in 1915 to see if they were all made from temporary wood and staff as presented, or if hard marble and granite could be spotted and touched on many of these structures. Another important question around all this destruction is, where did all the material from the ruined buildings go? It did not just disappear by magic. The narrative claims for St. Louis, for example, that the remains of the fair, all 1,200 acres of it, was dumped into 3 landfills. What landfills? Do you have any idea how much garbage 1,200 acres of massive buildings would produce? The landfill sites would be huge. So where are they? I wonder if there really are landfills, or if something else may have happened to the now garbage structures at the end of the fair. The same here with San Francisco. Almost 700 acres of destroyed buildings, equipment, and apparatus. Where exactly did it all get dumped? Can we locate those areas today and do some casual inspection to see if anything at those locations can be discovered? Pieces of unexplained marble pushing up through the soil, for example. Fairs to the present. The fair stopped altogether in 1915, the war being presented as the main reason for shutting them down. Though it took a long time to get them up and running again, and when they did in the 1930s, they were nothing like they used to be. Fun and entertainment replaced history and artwork. Flashy new modern buildings replaced the Greco-Roman style. This change has become even more prominent today. Now a sort of utopian presentation focuses on outer space, AI, and VR technology. Only 9 corporations had pavilions at the 1893 Chicago, while in the year 2000, almost every exhibit was corporate sponsored, in effect showing that corporations now run everything. The message prior to 1915 was that technology was the answer to everyone's problems, while now it is to trust that science and government would solve all of humanity's problems. The early fairs were all about industry and modernizing the savages. Now it is to display that science is the new great religion. The more recent fairs have ecology and saving the environment as key presentations, which is ironic given that many of the first fairs were all about how to control and force nature to do what humans, or rather the elite ruling humans, wanted it to do in order to make them a lot of money. The most recent World Exposition was in Milan 2015 and the next for Dubai in 2020, with a theme of Connecting Minds, Creating the Future. I, of course, have checked out a number of these modern expos, and while large and somewhat unique, they cannot hold themselves to the size, scale, and building opulence that was Chicago, St. Louis, Paris, or San Francisco. Ancient Rome was shown to be right in front of our noses, and perhaps it is still. The cities may have been part of a worldwide empire, and the expos, certainly Chicago, was modeled after 2 specific places, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House of Nero, and Hadrian's Villa. And these cities and others still have buildings from the 1800s that really defy explanation. If you live in the United States, just go to your local state capitol buildings, especially if you live west of the Mississippi. Look at the size of the dome, the quality of the stone, and the date given for the construction. Does it really add up? Where does this research take us?